film artist that Hitler used back in the 30s, and she's still alive today now in the 90s. A little sidelight on there. She didn't have such sophisticated equipment as this. So before I do the introduction, I want to thank a few people and organizations. First of all, the Friends of the Library, who are the main sponsors for the program tonight. They funded this and some of our other adult programs that we have. There's also funding from Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for Humanities. And a special thanks to Dina Pesch on the library staff, who has done all the organizing and legwork on this program, and our women's night in at the library, the programs we've had there and the various things. So Dina does a great job on this, and it's great to have her do that so I can just sort of sit back in the background and watch a very successful library activity develop. There's different reasons for us to be here. I see some of you who may have had actual experience from the time period that Michael's going to be talking about. Some of you may have been to Alabama to see the nativity scene that's up there that was done by German POWs. I have some interest. I grew up in Minnesota, about 30 miles from Howard Lake, where there was another German prison camp. And when I was in 7th grade, my history teacher was from that town, and he told us a lot about that. And he was in the town at that time. None of us had ever realized that there were Nazi soldiers in Minnesota. When I was in graduate school, I lived in West Branch, which is real close to Scattergood, and I went past the school many times, and I always wondered what it was and what the history of it was, and I think we'll hear a little bit about that tonight. I think the other thing that today is of interest as well, we speak about World War II, but really World War II was the first war that truly had global involvement, and I think that's why Michael has chosen the title, Hitler Comes to the Heartland. And if we look at today, we see that we here in Iowa are influenced by people far away, whether they be good or evil, because of the power and the influence of people and countries. Saddam Hussein has a big effect on us here in Iowa. George Bush has a big effect on people in Colombia or Korea. We're affected by Chirac in France, and the people in France are affected by George Bush. So we truly are a global community, and I think World War II was the time that this true global aspect came to be. Michael Luke Trams grew up in Iowa on a farm up by Mason City. Graduated from Iowa State University and did graduate work in Berlin, Humboldt University, where he earned his PhD in modern European history. At this time, he is the director of Traces, which is a nonprofit organization that works to gather and preserve the stories of people from the upper Midwest and how they interrelated with Germans during the World War II period. There is a website that you can see. It's traces.org. So now that we've got our equipment going and we've taken care of the introduction, Michael will entertain us and inform us.
Thank you. Actually, I have the feeling that we could almost do the presentation just for the director. I mean, many of the stories we'll tell have to do with his own biography, but indeed, I think you'll find the stories are of interest to everybody, whether you ever lived in a town that had a German POW camp, or if you ever went through West Branch, Iowa. I'm going to tell numerous stories tonight. Some of them I'll just mention in passing, and other ones I'll tell them probably in more depth than you ever wanted to know about them. But indeed, there were numerous connections between Iowa, our beloved homeland, and Nazi Germany. You have to remember that for the people living in Europe in the late 30s, early 40s, Iowa might as well have been Mongolia or outer reaches of Africa. It was the end of the world. And yet there were thousands of Germans who ended up here because of the war. Now, you know about some of these people, you just don't know that you know them, all right? For example, who's the little girl who wrote her famous diaries in hiding in Amsterdam? And where was her pen pal from? Danville, Iowa, just east of here, near Burlington. Little Anna Frank, as she would have known herself, was writing letters to Danville, Iowa, to Anita Wagner, and her older sister Margaret Frank was writing to Mary Ann, or Betty Ann Wagner. And you can find out about that by going to our website and clicking down the pages. Speaking of refugees, there's another story with an Iowa connection that you already know about. You just don't know that you know it. And I just got here 6:45, having driven from this town. I just came up the road from Keokuk. Anybody ever heard of Keokuk here? Anyway, the Von Trapp family from The Sound of Music fled Nazi occupation of Austria, came to the United States, had their famous chalet and inn in Vermont, but to get there they had to make money, and they went on the road with their little girls in Drindle and their little boys in Vonderhosen, Lederhosen, and they sang for people in Keokuk and in Mount Vernon, Iowa, home of Cornell College. Now, the day after the night concert by the Von Trapp family, they all piled into their little Von Trapp mobile, and they drove down to West Branch, Iowa. And what did they do there? They sang for the refugees. There was a Schindler's List on the prairie, but nobody knows about it. In West Branch, from 1939 to 43, there were 186 refugees. The video I'm about to show you from Iowa Public TV says 185. It is actually, we found another one last year. 186 who fled the Nazis and were brought to safety on the Iowa prairie. So why don't we look at a 10-minute video from Iowa Public Television about this story, and then you'll have a better sense of what this is all about. It is a Schindler's List on the prairie. Nobody knows about it, at least they didn't used to, but now people are indeed learning about this story. Give us 1 millisecond to figure out the technical snafus again. Which button is it for the video?
I think we should have it right there.
So I just push play. And the volume.
Judy will check to make sure.
And I need the volume too. So I actually pushed play, but oh, it is
got
playing.
it playing, and there you go.
I need the volume.
The volume, let's just.
It's a little bit too much.
No?
Just a second. Let's try that.
For the 1939 residents of West Branch,
a little higher, I'm
Iowa,
afraid.
this gravel lane served as the main route into town. But to European refugees trying to escape Hitler's tyranny, the dusty Iowa road was a path to safety.
Basically, we're talking about Schindler's List on the prairie. The only difference is that everyone in the world knows about Oskar Schindler and the 1,100 Jews he saved in Middle Europe. Almost no one knows about the 185 refugees that Iowa Quaker farmers and college kids saved.
From 1939 to 1943, nearly 200 refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe found a safe haven at Scattergood Hostel, a makeshift commune on the site of what had been a Quaker boarding school. Here, outside the small town of West Branch, Iowa Quakers hosted Jews as well as Hitler's political dissidents, offering them food, shelter, and a glimmer of light in the midst of Nazi darkness.
Admittedly, 185 is a drop. Well, it's not even a drop in the bucket compared to 6 million people who perished at Auschwitz and Treblinka and all the other death camps. But 185 souls saved was more than what was being saved down the road. I mean, this story is a story, a remarkable story of Iowa Quaker farmers and college students who had no connection with these people, had no obligation, and in many cases couldn't even correctly pronounce their names, but brought them over from Berlin and Prague and Vienna and Budapest and saved their lives. If the Quakers had not saved them, they would have all been killed at Auschwitz and gone up the chimney as ashes. But because of the bravery of some people, their lives were saved. People pretty much like you, actually.
For author Michael Lewitt Trams, the Scattergood story is an example of goodness during a time of hatred. A rarity in world history he feels compelled to share with everyone he can, from Quaker congregations to these Des Moines high school students.
If you were a refugee, where would you go? Where would you find help? Who would help you? Most people don't do anything in most areas of their lives to actively, ongoingly help someone else. You know, life as hard as it is, we don't want to be responsible or feel responsible for somebody else, so we turn the other way. Well, during the Third Reich, most people ignored these peoples who were trying to scurry out of harm's way. What's amazing is that the Iowa Quakers didn't.
like with getting to know a person, the more that you get to know about Scattergood Hostel, the more you realize this is exciting, this is life-changing. If I involve myself in this, if I invest my heart, not just my head, but my heart in this story, it will change me.
For Michael, pictures of Scattergood offer a glimpse into just how unique the hostel really was. In fact, you'd swear these to be snapshots of a peaceful family farm rather than images of a wartime refugee camp. Unlike most service agencies, which offered limited assistance during business hours only, Scattergood operated as a full-time commune, with each refugee staying an average of 4 months. Here, Quakers and Jews not only shared field work and daily chores, but also the tremendous burden of war's impact.
Some of the people had been through great trauma. Some had known hunger, had been beaten. Some had been in Dachau. Another refugee would come down to the pantry at night and steal lard. He had known severe hunger at camp and just eat lard to regain weight and to satisfy his hunger. But by that point, the hunger probably wasn't just physiological, it was also psychological. Some of the refugees arrived with children or spouses still back in Europe. Some of them would pace the hallway at night and they couldn't sleep. Back and forth, back and forth. None of these 49 volunteers had had any training. They didn't know what post-traumatic syndrome was. They hadn't been instructed in psychology or in counseling, and yet they came and gave what they had the most of, which was vitality and enthusiasm, idealism, and love. On a practical level, that love meant, I'm going to listen to your story even when I'm tired and I have 5 other things distracting me. Love means that when you're hurting, I'm strong enough to ask you what you're hurting about, and we'll really listen to the answer. There's something that all of us could do to help out the life of someone.
While Quaker representatives in Europe helped refugees secure immediate needs like visas and passage money, Iowa Quakers, with their modest resources, channeled efforts into long-reaching acts of human kindness, opening their homes to the war-torn Europeans whose harrowing escapes had led them to the United States. In addition to therapeutic social activities, the Scattergood staff provided health care, language classes, and job training, hoping to give refugees, or guests as they were called, a foundation on which to rebuild their lives.
They wanted these tattered and tired people to feel that they were worthy of respect, even if they learned fabulous English and they could work wonders with a hammer and saw. If the people had not found their own centers, if they'd not rediscovered themselves while at Scattergood, all the practical training in the world would not have made a big difference. When you're under that much attack, under that much stress, I think your soul goes on vacation. You have to vacate your life, your biography, your body, just to survive. At Scattergood Hostel, people's souls, people's spirits could rejoin their bodies, the biographies. People could rest. Quakers intended this a place to be where people could regather themselves, and indeed that's what happened.
Of the 23 children who passed through Scattergood, all but 3 became either teachers, psychologists, or social workers, each demonstrating a desire to share the goodness found on the Iowa prairie. For the young guests, Scattergood was an introduction to Midwestern treats, like marshmallows and pony rides. But for 15-year-old Gunter Krauthammer, it was also a long-awaited return to serenity.
After Hitler came to power, it was a frightening situation, really. I knew I wasn't going to, I couldn't live in Germany, but you don't know where you're going to end up. So you have this uncertainty, because you don't know where you're going to go to school, you don't know where you're going to be when you grow up, you don't know what's going to happen, and everything is always temporary. You don't know what to expect, and you don't make any plans, because there's no point in making plans, because everything is too unpredictable. So Scattergood made a huge impression on me, a very deep impression, and in retrospect, it sort of looms as a safe haven. I guess really the first one in my own life that I had. And of course, when I came here, that was back in 1942, and maybe some of your grandparents went to school here at that time.
In May of 1998, Gunter, or George as he's now called, returned to West Branch for the first time in over 50 years, responding to letters from these middle school students who were studying Scattergood as part of their Holocaust unit.
So we had to sort of sneak out of the country by, going through some backwoods and crawling out of some barbed wire with the help of somebody who guided us across the border. And I was very scared, I'll tell you.
As a child in Hitler's Germany, this New Jersey professor of neuroscience tried to accept hardships as adventures, even attempting to view his dangerous escape into Belgium as a journey into a new land. But despite his self-proclaimed optimism, the complexities of having a German Christian mother and a Jewish father were often too overwhelming to comprehend.
They were all marched to the edge of town, and most of them were shot, and the others were put into cattle cars and brought to a concentration camp. I see my Jewish uncle gets killed, my German uncle, because he survived during the war. I think it's important for anybody, certainly for children, to realize that, to know about it, and to realize that such things can have happened, and in a sense still happen in other places. And I think it actualizes history to some extent. I think that's important.
After class, a handful of students accompanied George on a visit to Scattergood, which has today returned to a Quaker boarding school. While most of the hostel's original buildings are long gone, the grounds still hold some of George's fondest memories, like the tree under which the 15-year-old refugee spent Iowa's hot summer nights, and the echoing spirit of the Quakers who forever changed his life.
Scattergood somehow has meant a great deal to me, and I can't put it into words, but it must have, because I've constantly thought about it, and wherever I go, whatever it was just a very unique and powerful experience for me. It changed my life.
In the beginning, Scattergood was created to counter the tragedies of racism, but ironically, it was racism itself that brought the hostel to a close. In later years, as the war in Europe escalated, it became nearly impossible for European refugees to find safe passage to Scattergood. The Iowa Quakers then turned their attention to Japanese Americans who had been forced into relocation camps. However, the West Branch residents, who had once embraced European refugees, now vehemently refused to accept Japanese Americans into their town. Unable to fight the town's protests, the Quakers were forced to close the hostel, bringing Scattergood's 4-year path of light to a dark end.
Where'd my tech person go? What I'd like now is to shut this thing off. I've got the video rewinding, but... Oh, all right. Do we need to let the fan blow? Do we need to let the fan blow so the bulb doesn't burn? Materials to show you. I'll illustrate that just as there were 500 camps across the country, there were 2 base camps in Iowa, and there were probably about 50 branch camps in Iowa, Minnesota, and the 2 Dakotas from the 2 base camps. The 2 base camps were at Algona, and its branch camps numbered 35, and they were across to Minnesota, 20 of them, Iowa, 10 of them, and 2 in both Dakotas. And Clarinda, the other base camp, would have had its branch camps in southern Iowa, northern Missouri, probably northeast Kansas, eastern Nebraska. There were 435,000 Axis POWs in this country at the end of the war. That's a lot. 378,000 Germans, 50,000 Italians, and about 5,000 to 8,000 Japanese. Iowa was only one of 2 states to have all 3 Axis power prisoners. Clarinda was built by German labor, and then those boys were sent out to make way for Japanese, who, unlike the Germans and the Italians, did not work outside the camp. And many of those German boys were sent to Algona. But Algona had the opposite fate. It was actually built by Italian labor, and they were sent out, the poor boys, to New Jersey, and they made way for the Germans. Aha! Now if I could just get rid of that little white box, although I can't be a perfectionist, although I suppose I could. Anyway, we have a slideshow about the story of the Germans in Iowa. Voila! All right. And we call it the Fritz Ritz because in actuality, the Germans were treated quite well. Anyway, here's the map that I was waiting to show. You know where Clarinda is? Down here. And its branch camps would have been here. I was told in Washington, Iowa, there were German POWs in Wapello, or however you pronounce it. And I also know that there was a branch camp of Clarinda at Audubon. So I'm guessing there would have been other branch camps near you. I don't think it was from Clarinda, but we know there was a branch camp in Hannibal, Missouri, for example. Anyway, if you had driven up Highway 18, past the front gate of the camp, as my mother had as a girl at Camp Algona, you would have seen the American sector of the camp with the theater and the PX and the administrative buildings and the hospital. But what interests me as a scholar are really the 3 compounds behind the American part, where up to 1,000 German POWs at a time were housed. It was a prisoner of war camp. Who were these 10,000 German POWs? And notice that I don't say Nazi POWs because it's really an error. It'd be like saying any 10,000 American POWs in Nazi Germany were all Republicans, or were all Democrats, or were all Catholics, or Baptists, or you get the picture. These 10,000 German POWs included boys like this one. They included older men with wives and children and businesses and farms and congregations back in Germany. There were brothers, and the government actually had a program that if the POWs pooled their money together and paid for the guard and the train ticket, then our government would send one POW, for example, from a camp in Florida to be with his brother, in this case in New Ulm, Minnesota. In actuality, the men, however, only had each other. Their possessions had really been taken away from them, and they formed friendships which survive up until this day, although of course the men are dying, just as are the Iowa POWs who were in Nazi Germany, and we'll get to their story after this one. But while they were here, they had their own kitchen, and they were in charge of their own food. They were very happy for the steak and the beer, but they hated our Wunderbrot, the Wonder Bread, and they would mash it into balls and throw it back and forth. This painting, by the way, whoops. This painting, by the way, comes from a book that our nonprofit, in fact, we're not just nonprofit, we're money losing, but our nonprofit group traces. You laugh, but I don't get paid. Anyway, we handle this book as well. These are the paintings of a German half-Jew who fled the Nazis with his family, got to America, and he was drafted and sent out here at age 18 to be an interpreter for the POW camps. And so these paintings are from Thomas Nagle, who's still alive, and he might be coming to our conference at Coe College at the end of May. Anyone is welcome to attend. It's about all POWs of World War II. Anyway, this painting by Thomas Nagle depicts finally the government got it and stopped giving the boys Wunderbrot and gave them whole grain flour to bake their beloved Schwarzbrot. Anyway, while they were here, they ate fairly well. They had good medical care and dental care. And why was it that we took such good care of these men? Well, one of the reasons was, it wasn't just altruism. One of the reasons was we thought if Hitler got word that we were treating his POWs well, then he would treat American boys over there better. And it is a fact that Americans were treated infinitely better than the Russians, who were treated beastily. Excuse me, in fact, in polite society, I can't even really talk about how the Russians were treated. Half of them died in German captivity. At any rate, another reason was we needed the labor. So we would send these boys out to the Red River Valley to work in cabbage patches like this one, in greenhouses in Yankton and Shenandoah and Moorhead, out in hemp plants and hemp fields. And then in small numbers off-season, we'd send them out to individual farms, 3 or 5 at a time. Did not require a rifled guard, but if there were 5 or more, there'd be a guard at all times, although mostly they slept. Well, I've actually interviewed 55 of these men, and for example, I interviewed Alfred Neighbor a couple times, and you just see these stories and you think, oh, that's an interesting photograph. But actually, each of these photographs has many stories behind it. For example, this one. On this day that this picture was taken, Alfred Neighbor made a comment to this farmer in the background and said, you know, I've seen this country's vast roads and many cars and endless factories and fields. I think we've lost the war. He's not sure who did it, but he thinks it was this Hitler Youth-looking twerp over here who squealed to the Nazi clique in the camp. And he's not sure who did it, but he thinks it was his buddy with the pilot's glasses who tipped off the American guards. And they took Neighbor out because the clique was going to kill him. In fact, the camp commander called in the German spokesman and said, what's this I hear about you boys are going to kill Neighbor if he's in the camp? And the spokesman said, indeed we will. So they sent him to the director's home part of the world, to Howard Lake, Minnesota. It was an anti-Nazi camp. So these 10,000 Nazis weren't 10,000 Nazis at all. They were anti-Nazis. We know that more than 100 German POWs were murdered, often brutally, unspeakably, by their comrades for anti-Nazi comments or something against the war. And we know there were Catholic priests forced into uniform. Any of you Catholics? 2, 3. Imagine you're a priest being forced into uniform, okay? There were Austrians, Hungarians, Poles, Romanians, Russians, you get the idea. No matter what their persuasion, politically or otherwise, the men were sent out to work, for example, to New Ulm, Minnesota. And here's Howard Lake, Minnesota. They were picking sweet corn for the Cokato Canning Company. He's grinning, the director is pleased. All right, here they are in New Ulm, gleaning field corn that had fallen. They were sent out to work in the commandos doing flood control on the Missouri River. They poured concrete silos for farmer cooperatives, like in Plainfield, Iowa. They put sewers down Main Street in Renwick, Iowa. They built tract houses in Charles City, Iowa. These boys were everywhere doing everything, putting roofs on barns. Okay, you get the idea. Painting. Whoops, I'm going the wrong direction. Painting. Here they are taking a break. And in small groups, they literally came into our homes, like this one over near Tabor and Shenandoah. And they made friends with the farm families, with the elders, and with the juniors. And do take a note of the girl in the regrettable plaid skirt. I'll talk about Wanda in a moment. Anyway, and also take a note of this makeshift gate at Camp Moorhead. The branch camps were not like Algona. Algona was a U.S. military camp with barbed wire and watchtowers and machine guns. Otherwise, the Army used the same blueprints because, according to the Geneva Convention, thank God we've got that, to semi-regulate how prisoners are treated, at least in signee nations. Anyway, according to the Geneva Convention, you're supposed to house enemy soldiers like you would house your own. And so we used our own blueprints. But the branch camps were another story. They weren't barracks and whatever, with PXs and theaters and whatever. These were 4-H exhibit halls at fairgrounds. They were winter sports buildings like in Crookston, Minnesota. They were former CCC camps. They were the old Tabor College that had closed because of the Depression in Tabor. They were at the Indian Sanatorium in Toledo. They were at something in Clinton. I never quite understood this, but there was like the Kiwanis building or whatever up on the hill over downtown, overlooking downtown Clinton. So they were everywhere in all kinds of makeshift places. One of the homes that they were living, Senator Cashman's home in Owatonna, Minnesota, burned down while they were there. So where were they housed next? In the top of the fire station. All right. Well, you can see that just as here, this one POW's befriended his boss, Paul Horn. Here he is with one of the guards, and we know that on his 23rd birthday, this guard got a cake from the POWs with 23 candles. The men were put to work, however, not just making friendships, they were out working, like cutting wood at Algona. Also, they were sent to northern Minnesota to cut real wood up to 20 below zero until our axes shattered. And I've interviewed men who worked up there, and they said that the P's and W were for target practice, but it's not true. They worked at brick and tile plants, at hemp plants, at chicken plucking plants. And do take note of the man third from the left with a little X on his white cap. I'll come back to Wilhelm Martens in a bit as well. They worked a lot in canneries, like for the Jolly Green Giant. Ho, ho, ho. Green Giant. Here they are getting the cans ready for shipment. Now you're probably wondering, what were German POWs doing working at canneries? Well, this is an advertisement from the Waverly, Iowa newspaper. And notice the smoldering European city in the background. That's an interesting piece of wartime advertising psychology. One of the lovely girls to respond to the call for wartime labor was Evelyn Grabo, who at 80 or something is still lovely and gracious up in Owatonna, Minnesota. Actually, I sort of dig that dress. So she would go to work at the Owatonna cannery, and when she would come, she would find little love notes on her stool in front of her machinery. And when she went home, she'd leave little chocolates, or maybe she'd knit a scarf, or some socks. Well, here are two of the love letters that she got. And I'm reading from one of Trace's books. One of the things we do besides educational programming and exhibits and conferences and citizen exchanges and whatever is we publish books. And we've just published this wonderful book. It's my favorite, actually, to be honest. Signs of Life. And it's the 300 letters in English of the German POWs in Iowa and Minnesota to their families back home, or from their families to them. And related documents like Today Without Demur. This guy obviously had a dictionary. Today without demur, we meet us last time. How variable is one's character. In former times, living in riot and revelry, I was often dissatisfied. Now it makes me inexpressible happy, only to see one person for some little seconds. More I cannot say. Goodbye, be happy forever. And in pencil at the bottom he wrote, is it possible to be sad and happy in the same time? Yes, I say. His second note to lovely Evelyn. Evelyn, last time I was very sorry to cannot have say you goodbye as I wanted to do it. Perhaps I work once more Monday night when the others have their free day. For the case I cannot do so. I shall keep you in best remembrance forever. My instantaneous dead life here thwarts all my plans. This boy obviously had a dictionary. My instantaneous life here, he means the one right now, thwarts all my plans. Most high schoolers in America don't know what the word thwart means. Anyway, thwarts all my plans, and it is senseless to meditate and to build castles in the air. But what I have told to you was the plain, unvarnished truth and my conviction. The feeling to have made the acquaintance of one person so very congenious makes me happy, and I have a good knowledge of human nature. From this country I get only unagreeable experiences. This is a beautiful exception. I congratulate you very much for your future, R. period. And the bottom says, and now you know, speech is silver, silence is golden. Don't you just want to weep? I mean, it's so beautiful. Now, unfortunately, the men were not just writing love letters, they were writing hate notes. For example, these. Americans, Roosevelt not long ago. Never Americans will fight in overseas. Facts of today, the invasion ordered by Roosevelt has just started and will claim hecatombs of American life. Hecatomb means many score of sacrifices. Or this one, I think someone's trying to come in, but the doors are locked. American mother, where's your son? He's lying dead on the beach of France. What was he fighting for? You don't know. I think they were stealing the onion paper from the carbon copies in the camp office, and somehow, maybe with linoleum or something, they were printing these, and they were going to distribute them, but they were caught at the gate and confiscated. Now, this sort of antic earned them some enemies as well as buddies. For example, this is the report from Fargo, North Dakota. It's Rotary Club. And down here, the guard who gave the talk said, they are cocky and arrogant. They are deeply resentful of being penned up with barbed wire, for they feel that they are the superior race. The rest you can read yourselves. And don't you adore the graphics? Rotary wheel being pushed by the labor of America up the hill to the post-war world. I think it's great. Now, I told you, and I'll beat this horse a couple more times, there were 10,000 people at Algona. There weren't 10,000 Nazis or 10,000 monsters or 10,000... There were people. Some of them were nice, some of them were jerks, some of them were clever, some were dolts, some were fat, some were skinny, some were Catholic, some were atheists. Some of them were brilliant, some of them were poets. And we've got a poem from the camp newspaper. Usually my tall, gangly, mildly obnoxious assistant is with me, but I left him in Mason City because we're putting out the sister book to this one. This is about the letters of the POWs. We're putting out their newspapers. They had 2 newspapers. The first one was pro-Nazi, the second one was anti-Nazi, and it came out, of course, after the German capitulation. This poem is from number 1, Brothers. A dead man lay in front of our mound of barbed wire already a long while. As the sun shone down upon him, the wind and dew cooled him. I looked into his face all those days and had the feeling ever stronger, that must be my brother. I saw how he laid before me all those hours and heard his voice out of happier days of peace. And often in the night there came a crying which drove me out of my sleep. My brother, dear brother, don't you love me anymore? Until I, despite all the bullets, crawled to him in the night and hauled him back and buried him, an unknown comrade. My eyes, they did confuse me, but my heart you confuse me not, for in the face of every dead man is the face of my brother. Our book will be out soon about the letters, and I hope that you can share in it. It's got amazing documentation. The men drew graphics, they had crossword puzzles, there were poems, essays, letters. It's quite a document. Well, they were also using poetry in a humorous way. For example, they did what I've never been able to do, although my mother still wants me to do it, is to publish a hardcover book. They published a hardcover comic book, go figure, and had 48 plates with rhyming verse, all of them humorous, about breaking camp or breaking a leg. And one of the cartoons that's not featured here is what was called a Fernvertrauung. And it basically translates as a long-distance wedding. Because in actuality, you would have at Camp Algona the groom and the priest and the ring and the best men and a cake, really. And in Germany you would have the bride and the crying mother and the father and the village priest and the bridesmaids and a cake and the ring, but no groom. These were legal weddings, and hundreds, if not thousands, of couples in the Third Reich were married, Fernvertrauung, long distance. Remember the guy in the chicken plucking plant? Say chicken plucking plant 3 times a day and it's really... Well, he was sketching his journal. And this is his rendition of Camp Fairmont. Unfortunately, we Americans bulldozed it in the 80s to build a Red Owl supermarket, which has since gone belly up. We have to learn a few things about historical preservation. Anyway, he drew in his journal Minnesota with a German S, and if you go to our website, traces.org, you can actually click on exhibits and go down to 3D items, the 3 different choices, and you can see the wooden Indian head that he created. This was the model for it. Of course, he wanted to go home. Who wouldn't want to go home? And he wrote, Der Stacheldraht fällt, the barbed wire falls, and he boldly saw him and his comrades marching home when the barbed wire fell. However, it wasn't quite going to be like that. Another one of his pages in his journal, and it's really a wonderful, wonderful journal. It's amazing. It was very prophetic. Now, I don't know how he knew this, but he contemplated when can this damn war be over? And he thought maybe by 1950, POW comes home. And it really turned out this way when he did get home. His little daughters, there were 3 of them, they hadn't seen Poppy in over 8 years. 4 years as a soldier, 4 years as a POW. And the one little girl said, Granny, who's that? Your daddy. When do you think he actually got home? As you all know, the war was over for the Europeans, May 8th, 45. When do you think the Germans got home from who'd been in America? We had a program which was actually in defiance of the Geneva Convention, where we re-educated 20,000 of the hand-picked German soldiers, gave them democracy classes in English, and those 20,000 were the first sent back summer of '46 to become mayors, editors, teachers, administrators. But the other unlucky devils, they were sold, 3/4 of them were sold to the British and the French to work in French mines or on British farms behind barbed wire and machine guns until 1948, September of 1948. So 3.5 years after the war is over, finally Wilhelm Martens comes back home, and we have his suitcase, we have the duffel bag with Wilhelm Martens and his number, we have the journal, and it's a document of what happened, what's gone before. The Germans who'd been with us had it quite good. The 3 million German POWs, that's the population of Iowa, the 3 million German POWs marched off to Siberia after the war, by the Soviets to mine uranium and cut trees in labor camps. They suffered a lot. A third, in other words 1 million, died outright. They were starved, beaten, killed, shot. The other 2/3, the other 2 million, when do you think they got back to Germany? 1956. With encephalitis and rheumatism and cancers and things. And a lot of these boys had been 15 or so in April '45 when they were forced into the last guard. So they came back to Germany, basically almost 30, to start with their adolescence. They had never had a girlfriend or a car or a job. But while the boys were in our care here, they were treated fairly well. For example, they could visit the camp canteen to buy stationery, chocolates, stamps, razor blades. All these things are from the camp canteen, and we have them in our exhibit. They could buy pipes, playing cards, beer, tobacco. And if you go to our exhibit, it closes in Charles City, Iowa at the Art Center on Saturday. And it's supposed to open March 22nd, and then it'll be at the Music Man Square in Mason City until May 26th. We have over 1,000 items. Pipes carved with Camp Algona, Iowa, USA in them. We have chess pieces and watercolors and oil-based paintings and clothes and razor blades with stubble and foam dried in them, and it's a great exhibit. And if we could find a sponsor here in South Central Iowa, we'd bring it here, but we would need help for that. How did the men pay for these things? They had coupon books called scrib, because we were afraid if we gave them currency, I mean, they looked like us, basically 53% of all Iowans have German ancestry after all, they would skedaddle and have greenbacks to spend, so we'd give them their pay. They got $0.10 an hour. To give you a comparison, my father's mother worked in a hardware store in the 30s. She got $0.10 an hour. Anyway, here's their scrib. When they weren't in the canteen sipping beer, they'd play soccer. Here's their soccer team. They had a camp newspaper, as I said. They could also take lessons. They could study at night ancient Greek and German and French and physics and chemistry and music appreciation. They needed that because they had 17 bands and orchestras at Algona. They had an active theater life, many plays, concerts. In fact, if I'm honest, it's a good thing that we're not doing this program in Algona. None of you are from Algona or have relatives there, do you? I don't want my tires slashed. I just bought 4 of them this morning in Iowa Tire. There was more culture, I would say, at Camp Algona than there was in the town. In fact, in all seriousness, we have an almost complete collection of the Guards newspaper. There was the German POW newspaper and the Guards newspaper called the Powwow. It is the most embarrassing rag with dame jokes and, stories of drinking parties all through the night. And in actuality, many of the Guards were not fit for service abroad for various reasons, health problems, or a lot of them were Kentucky hillbillies who had drinking problems. The POWs I interviewed said that often the Guards would come and say, I have to go pee, and give them their gun and go off. Some of them wouldn't come back for a couple hours. One came back and passed out. He was so drunk. And the Germans, being German, they saw this, that he'd passed out. Well, they kept working, because they're Germans. And at the end of the day, he was still passed out. So they put him over their shoulder and walked back to camp because they were really afraid if the American guards thought they'd shot him, they'd be. So they put him by a tree 100 yards in front of the camp gate and put his rifle next to him and tiptoed back into camp. Okay? You get an idea of what was going on there. They also had a lot of Christmas activities. For example, in the Christmas of '44, this recuperating theater decorator and architect created wooden figurines as a nativity scene, and it was so popular that a year later the army actually gave him staff and funds and supplies to build a nativity scene that's most amazing. Have any of you ever seen the Algona nativity scene? We've got a charter bus and get you up there. Iowans love free things. It's free. You can go in December. They open it up. It's at the fairgrounds in Kossuth County, at the Kossuth County Fairgrounds. But this thing really exists. The Germans built it out of plaster of Paris over chicken wire and boards. And Maria and Joseph are 2/3 life-size, and there's sheep and everything. But more incredible than that, I think, there was a mountain with running water that would recycle, those clever Germans. There were stars that twinkled, there was a moon that glowed, and over here was a black curtain. Now you're thinking, oh, come on, it's 8:09 and we want to go home, and what are you talking about the black curtain? Just shut up and sit down. Well, the black curtain is important. Last fall, our group, which is nonprofit but a loss maker, we brought 23 Germans back to Iowa and Minnesota, and we took 14 of them on a tour of the former camps. When we were in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, we got out of our mini buses that we had to rent, and there were protesters there. It felt like Little Rock in the 50s. Anyway, there were people there who said, how dare you coddle the Germans, and our buddies died fighting these bastards. If these protesters would visit our website, they would see that we're the only group around that is recording the experience of Iowa POWs who were in Germany. We tell both sides of the story in both directions. Jerks. Anyway, so they're driving around, threatening us, going around the block, and they had to call the security personnel. They had to escort the Germans from the parking lot into the building, where we had invited former Iowa POWs who'd been in German camps to come. They sat at a long table, and the Iowans told their experiences from being over there as POWs, and the Germans told their experiences over here, and both men in the middle turned to each other after that and shook hands. After 60 years, the war can be over. 60 years is long enough. After 60 years, a war may be over. Okay. Well, when it was done, people in the audience had a chance to tell their stories. And this woman stood up with a cane, and she said, when I was a girl, her parents took her and siblings to Camp Algona, and they sat on planks on concrete blocks, and they would marvel at this nativity scene. And then all of a sudden it grew quiet, she said. And you could hear the footfalls out in the snow, crunch, crunch, crunch. And the door creaked open, and these black shadowy figures came in and went behind the curtain and began to turn the phonograph and to sing Christmas carols in German and English. And as she told the story, a tear went down her cheek. And she said it was the most beautiful Christmas in my life because it was the Christmas message incarnate of greatness of spirit and charity and love. Folks, it was an Oprah Winfrey moment. We all wanted to hug each other and we were all crying. Well, she sat down, and Herr Butzlaff, who had just shaken hands with a former Iowa POW, he stood up and said, you know, I was in that choir. So 60 years later, and if you want to read about this, go to the New York Times, because there was a New York Times reporter there, and we were written about on page 20A. It's like the 26th of September, or the 27th of September. We were on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. We were on the front page of the Des Moines Register. Maybe you read about us. And that was another story. How long do we have? Can you people stay till tomorrow? There are many stories. For example, the Des Moines Register wanted to get the scoop. You know, journalists are really, they're cutthroat careers. They drove up to Elizabeth, Illinois, near Galena, to be the first to get a scoop of the Germans coming to Iowa. Well, they interviewed Kurt Butzlaff up in that lookout tower east of Galena. And the next morning, we were on the front cover of the Des Moines Register, but it said, Nazi POWs come back to Iowa. And Kurt Butzlaff was incensed. He said, I was a 16-year-old farm boy from Prussia. I was forced in the military. I was never a Nazi, then nor now. And he said, this is a problem, because we see each other as stereotypes. The Nazis, or the Americans, or the Japanese, or the Iraqis. We strip people of their humanity, of their individuality, and then we can kill them easier. It's hard to pull out a gun and shoot Bertha sitting next to me if I know her and care about her or know about her personality. But if she's just a lump of flesh on a chair, then bing, she's gone. So we still do it. The Des Moines Register did it. One of the reasons we go around telling these stories is we don't learn everything that we could learn. And what Traces is about trying to get people to get up to speed, because we can't afford any more wars. People die in wars. You've not missed all the chances to see this thing. It still exists. Not exactly like it was 60 years ago, but pretty close. The mountain's gone, I think. And if you go to our exhibit at Music Man Square, you'll see our oil-based paintings and aquacolors and ink and line drawings. You'll see chess sets made from stolen U.S. Army broom handles that were then carved into chess pieces. They couldn't keep brooms in stock. Do you remember Wanda with the bad, regrettable plaid skirt? Bless her heart. Well, I went to her big Victorian farmhouse in southwest Iowa 2 falls ago. It was a beautiful, glorious fall day in Iowa. The colors and the air was just right and the sky was clear. I pulled up to her big Victorian porch and pulled out and went in and interviewed her about the 2 German POWs who'd been at her parents' farm during the war. And we talked and talked about how after the war they kept in contact, and she gave me letters and Christmas cards, and it was great. And as I went to leave, she said, oh, there's one more thing. I said, what's that? Oh, she said, well, I'm not sure that it'll be of interest to you, but if it is. And she turned, and on the floor was this gray thing hulking in the corner. She picked it up, put it on the table, and it stunk. She creaked open the lid, and it was the suitcase that one of the 2 men on their farm had made out of scrap wood from the local dump, out of Coke signs, because you can see the red paint coming through the gray paint. He made, with a football, the leather padded handle. He made the hinges, he made the chain. And he took those old candy wrappers, beer bottle labels, cigarette cartons, Christmas seals, the whole kit and the caboodle, varnished them into the lid of the suitcase. Well, I said to her, Wanda, why didn't he finish this? Oh, she said, the war ended, he was told that the dimensions of the suitcase were too big, and he left it with us. For 60 years, that thing laid in a basement in southwest Iowa. And you will see it at Music Man Square. Why does the library get with it and organize a charter bus to Mason City? I'm totally serious. Or get the bank to take Aunt Martha up to Mason City. All right. Now, the last story from the German POWs is not as happy as the other stories. Who do you think these people are? This woman's transparently honest. I don't know. All right. If only our politicians were that honest. So these are the Wolgadeutsche. And to understand the Wolgadeutsche story, you need to know about Catherine the Great, who of course didn't begin life as Catherine the Great. She began life as Catherine the Minor. Anyway, she was a German princess who married a Russian Tsar, and on the way to Russia she said, oh my God, I'm going to Russia. So she recruited these Mennonite farmers. You know about Mennonites. There's some in the next county over and up the road. They had been taken to Russia in the 1700s to turn the savannah and the swamps of the Volga River Valley, sort of like our Mississippi Valley, into farmland. And the promise was, if you do this, you won't have to fight war anymore. Adolf Hitler, though, wasn't quite of the same opinion as Catherine the Great. And when the Wehrmacht was pushing through southern Soviet republics on the way to the oil fields north of Afghanistan, we can talk about that later if you want also, they discovered the Wolgadeutsche. They said, ach, you're not these subhuman Russian scum that we should kill because they're wretched. You're Germans, be proud of it. And forced these pacifist Mennonite farm boys into uniforms and put them in the army. Now, fast forward a couple more years. You're not going to like this very much. It's going to hurt. Hope you're sitting down. You're going to squirm a bit. But as the war was drawing to a close, we agreed with Josef Stalin, the dictator that we got in bed with for a couple of years because we wanted to win the war. We agreed, okay, at the end of the war, you can have the Volga Deutsche back, the Volga Germans. So in November of 45, months before we sent the real Germans back to Europe, or actually not to Germany, but to England and France, we segregated the Volga Germans, sent them on trains to Norfolk, Virginia, put them on ships. Our boys guarded them, played poker and drank vodka and told dame jokes all the way to Helsinki. At Helsinki they said, bye, have a good life. And almost literally, as the soldiers turned around to get back into the ship, they could hear the fates of these Volga Deutsche. The Soviet officials took them to a warehouse over in the side of the harbor and then just shot them all down dead. Now, as I told you, we tell these stories because they're relevant. The first moral question of the evening was, how long can you keep the soldiers of a defeated nation? How long? 5 years, 5 months, 11 years? I don't know. How long are we going to keep the guys in Guantanamo Bay? Do you know? I don't know. Who are these people? We don't know. They haven't even talked to a lawyer. We don't know who they are. Next moral question is, to what degree is a victorious nation responsible not just for the well-being, the steak, potatoes, and pinup for the POWs, but their survival? If they die on our clock, did we kill them? I don't know. I just pose the questions. You have to answer them. Actually, while I'm getting up the slideshow about the Iowa POWs, are there a couple questions that I might be able to answer? Yes, be brave.
This isn't a question, but we have a heritage club, bank club. We were up there in Algona a couple of years ago.
Did you like it?
Yes and no.
Why is that?
And it was pretty powerful.
Well, maybe you covered it before I got here about the many of them escaped and stayed in the United States.
There were, in fact, as I understand, the Geneva Convention says soldiers have the obligation to try to escape, which is very odd. Why would you put that clause in there? Anyway, maybe a couple hundred did try to escape. All but like a dozen were apprehended by the end of the war. Many of them, like in Papago Park in Greater Phoenix, today it's suburban Phoenix, Tempe, they dug a tunnel 200 yards to the Salt River. They knew there was a river by their map. Well, they got there and they found no water. Anyway, they went to the local bar, had a bottle of beer, played cards, and came back. I mean, where are you going to go? So these men would return and surrender. There was about a dozen men who didn't come back, and the last of them surrendered himself in the 70s, 80s, or so. Any other questions? There was a hand over here.
Were the SS also treated like the Wehrmacht?
The SS at Algona, there were about 99 of them. They were segregated and kept to the side. They could be really mean.
Why were these Mennonite Russian soldiers segregated and sent back there, and why did they want them back just to kill them? I don't understand.
Bad-heartedness. Joseph Stalin was not our friend.
I know he wasn't,
Yeah.
but did he just want to get them back?
He thought they were treasonous.
They wouldn't be communists.
In fact, if fact be known, Russians, not German Russians or Jewish Russians, but Slavic Russians who were caught were shot by their own people if they were ever given back as traitors. And if you go and see the more recently made film, in German it's translated into English, the enemy in front of the gate. I don't know what the film was called in English, but it had Ralph Fiennes' brother or whatever. Anyway, it's a great film. As the Russians tried to storm the German front at Stalingrad, and they couldn't take it, and they turned around, they were shot by their own people because people who retreated were traitors. I mean, it was wretched. It's wretched. Any other questions before I... Could I get a glass of water? I have a big mouth and I get thirsty. Our next slide shows about the Iowa POWs. You know, I'm not going to let you out of here without wowing you with little facts and tidbits that you can drop at your next cocktail party. For example, the most American POWs in Nazi Germany came from Iowa per capita until the Battle of the Bulge. So from day one that we entered the war until the Battle of the Bulge, which was only 6 months before the war ended in Europe, this was December of '44, the most American POWs over there in German hands were Iowans per capita. Well, why is this? Yes. So, in North Africa, some have suggested in other presentations, mostly it was the Minnesotans who said this, well, Iowans are bad soldiers, or their guns didn't work. Oh, yeah. The truth is, Rommel's people were pushing forward. The American front, or better said the Iowa front, because it was the 34th Division from Red Oak and Shenandoah, collapsed. Fooey, kapui, kaput. I interviewed a guy last fall in southwest Iowa. He said it was chaos. I interviewed a guy day before yesterday in Centerville, and he's 85. He's still around, not much longer, I'm afraid. But he said it was absolute mayhem. And so the American forces came over with planes and dropped out pamphlets to our own boys, and it said, "Run by cover of night to the Kasserine Pass." I mean, that's pretty bad when the army is saying, "Get out of there." So, indeed, in one night in February '43, the Germans took 1,800 mostly Iowa boys. There were a couple Minnesotans and Dakotans in there just for good flavor, but who were these boys? They were Thurl Mesker from Knoxville, sort of up and over the road from you, sort of. He had worked for the J.C. Penney department store in Knoxville before the war, or Charlie Lloyd Jones, who worked for the road crew in Audubon County. Later ran a theater, Northwood, thank you. Dan B., little butterball from Burlington, was 17. He lied about his age because he didn't want to miss all the action. Well, it was a real downer. He was caught at his first battle, the Battle of the Bulge, and he spent 6 months in a POW camp, actually several POW camps over there. And regardless of what our protesters think and our detractors, we have published the journals of Iowa boys. Thurl Mesker kept this journal under his clothes, and then he hid them under the floor of the barn in East Prussia where he was kept. Excuse me. And as he was on an 87-day death march at the end of the war, he smuggled the diaries out, plus these, like the notes from the French POWs, and the list he made of the Red Cross package contents, and he kept with him the photos of the Voss family. I will tell you about the Vosses in a little bit. They're our poster family for why people shouldn't fight war. But back to our story. So the government would whip these Iowa boys into soldiers, send them over to Europe or to Northern Africa, or wherever they had to go to fight the Germans. And some that I have been in contact with said they were sort of looking forward to it. They almost had to be held back from going to whip Hitler's butt. Well, it didn't turn out like that. War rarely does. In fact, it's almost a given fact that every war has unfolded differently than its planners thought. What a surprise! How amazing that war doesn't go quite like the boys with the big planning rooms have, with the little maps and their movable tanks. You know, it doesn't work that way. It's odd. Ha! Imagine that. The 34th Division, as it retreated, encountered some nomadic Arab merchants who said, yeah, the Americans are over. And so the boys ran up into the mountains to get to the Kasserine Pass, got to the decoy truck. Out came the German tanks, and they were caught. 1,800, those are the ones who weren't killed. 1,800 is a lot of men. Most Iowa towns don't even have half that. They marched them off through the desert, past German and American graves in the sand. They were flown from Tunis to Italy. I met a man, I interviewed him yesterday in Ottumwa, wonderful guy. That was really a highlight, actually. He must be 83 and sharp as a tack. He probably whipped my butt. Anyway, he was there, and he was one of the few that was actually kept in Italy to process the other ones that were coming, and it was really, really interesting, the stories that he could tell. He was a medic. Dan Bede, the little butterball from Burlington who'd been a soda jerk at his dad's soda fountain in South Burlington, he had a different experience. He wasn't caught in the whipping sands of northern Africa, but rather the whipping snow of northern Europe. In the coldest winter in living memory then, the winter of the Battle of the Bulge, 44, 45. And once I had a guy in Shenandoah say, gee, why don't you tell more bad stories. And I said because they're everywhere in great numbers, and Traces looks for stories of humans rising above their tribe and their period to do the right thing. For example, this German woman, Dan wrote in his narrative, which is basically the second half of this book, he wrote that as he and the other boys were being marched over the Eifel into Germany, a cottage door opened, and a little German woman came out and looked to see if the guards were watching, and when not, she ran out with her basket and gave her bread to all the Iowa POWs. She could have been shot for that. Being 17, Dan Bede thought this was a great adventure. You know? He said that as we marched down the Rhine, we could see the castles up on the cliffs, and it was great until they got to a freight yard and they were put into freight cars for several days at a time. No toilet, no water, no food. They, like the boys 2 years earlier caught in North Africa, were sent to all around Germany, many of them through Moosburg, through the base camp in Bavaria. They were distributed across Germany. Gesundheit. And all these camps were not very nice. The barracks were pretty Spartan. But Dan Bede, the eternal optimist, said, at least I got to see the world. He met POWs from the Soviet Union and Serbia, France, Britain, Poland, and from India, the Gurkhas, who were the ancient warriors caste who had protected the Raj up until the British stole India from the Indians, and then they protected His Majesty. Imagine them walking around Nazi Germany with their big brown turbans and their caftans. It's quite an image. But the Iowa boys in the light uniforms met, for example, these French POWs who gave them this note and their tobacco ration and said, we've heard the Germans are going to send you out on a work commando. Bon voyage, bon chance, good luck. If you survive, tell our wives that we'd survived up till now. And we have that note. Back in Iowa, you ever been to Pleasantville? It really exists. Pleasantville, Iowa. I had to think of that film. Anyway, in Pleasantville, Iowa, Mom and Dad are getting telegrams that Junior's gone lost. There was a lot of crying that went on. And the articles appeared in the local papers. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the boys were being photographed. Here's Thurl Mesker's mugshot. I think actually the left one might be a U.S. Army mugshot, and the right one a German mugshot. At any rate, notice the guard in the background on the right. Charlie Lloyd Jones from Audubon was an officer, and he had a very different experience. And look at him, he sort of looks like a fashion plate, but that wouldn't last very long. Here's all Iowa officers in occupied Poland at a former Polish military school. They'd just been issued new uniforms, and they felt an obligation to put on their best front, so to speak, and they put on the uniforms, the new ones that just arrived. But a couple of them, if you look closely, they look sort of gaunt. Charlie is gone as all these men are gone. But in the old days, he gave presentations, and this group lived for 2 years in a room about 9 by 11 feet. These are his notes. When I was a kid, my bedroom was 9 by 12, and I thought it was tiny. Just think of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 men in a room 11 by 9 feet. It wouldn't be fun. There's the camp from the air, Oflag 64. And remember the gate at Camp Moorhead, that flimsy thing? The Germans did the same thing. Both governments just threw up poles and barbed wire and called someplace a camp. It was hardly deserving of a camp status. Look how bleak this camp was. I've been to Bart, for example, that former camp. It's on the Baltic coast. It's pretty bleak in winter. Like the Germans here, the Iowa boys over there were writing poetry. The officers were paid money. You've seen Algona's money, now you've seen the German money. Like the Germans here, they had art shows, at least the officers did, sketches and model planes, and they put on plays. Edward G. Robinson, that was his name? He was in a film, Brother Orchid, about a mafioso who hides out in a monastery. You know, think about how odd war is. Down the road from this occupied Polish officers' camp was Auschwitz. And the Germans were murdering thousands of Jews every week, maybe tens of thousands, like on an assembly line conveyor belt. And up the road, the Iowa boys are putting on a comedy. I mean, it's not their fault, but just how odd reality is. war really makes a very schizophrenic world. That's not a very nice world once you know how it really was. Here they are taking their curtain call bows. It was a different kind of entertainment. Like the Germans in Iowa, the Iowa boys were getting uniform, musical instruments and makeup and props from the YMCA and the Red Cross. They're sort of a cute couple if you think about it for a moment. You know. They put on this black face. You notice the floodlight in the front with somebody's uniform over it to cover it up. A minstrel show. Can you read that? YMCA, that costs extra though. YMCA furnished instruments, music, makeup kit, costumes, and all else was improvised from everything imaginable. Well, yes, when I lived in Berlin there was a YMCA there. I don't know if they existed as buildings and sites during the war. There was a YMCA presence. Whether those were German YMCA people or American YMCA, I don't know. Usually the Red Cross delegations tended to be not from a given country. For example, the Red Cross that inspected the camps here were Swiss. I know the Danes and the Swedes, the Swedish Red Cross was active in Germany, so maybe they were the ones doing this good work. But these officers, unlike the enlisted men, they had all this time in their hands because they didn't have to work. And Charlie was making a list of all the books they were reading and lists of each other. And you thought I was just pulling your legs, but it's really true. When I told you that more Iowans were POWs in Germany per capita to the end of the war than anybody else. Tabor, Iowa, Council Bluffs, Iowa, Jefferson, Iowa, Shenandoah, Sibley, Iowa. You get the idea. Do you know that we're only 1% of the national population today? I find that a scandal. We're so unimportant. Iowans are 1% of the it's sad. This is why your Medicare doesn't get taken care of because we're only 1% of the population in this country. Council Bluffs, Iowa, Centerville, Iowa. In fact, when I was in Centerville 3 nights ago at the library giving this presentation, they said, we know him. He's still alive. He lives in Rockford, Illinois. And down below, the men had begun writing recipes. They couldn't even cook, and they had nothing to cook with, but they were writing recipes to kill the time. Another way to kill the time, but you were limited how many per week you could write, they'd write letters. And the Germans had this paper, actually I've got a sample, I should go get it. In fact, I think I will go get something. Anyway, it was as if someone took a big Tipp-Ex brush and covered it. The Germans made it so that if you put invisible ink in it or scratched in invisible codes, it would show up. We were a little bit more clever. Our government created stationery for these POWs out of blue paper that if you ran a water wheel over it, invisible ink would show up. And both governments pretty quickly agreed, they didn't agree on much, but they agreed on this, to not require POWs to put stamps on their letters because, why? Yes, he's been reading our book already. All right. All right. They didn't want codes to be put under the stamps. All of this stuff was read. Now, you've probably already gathered that I'm not a big fan of war. War is a really inefficient use of people's time and energy. Think of all the millions of letters from POWs that had to be censored. And think of all the bored housewives who could speak different languages or whoever they got, college kids, sitting around reading lovesick soldiers' POW post. What a waste of time. The Germans read the letters, then the Americans read them. And over here we read the POWs' letters, then the Germans read them. And I've got letters that have been entrusted to us. First, one technique is just to take black ink and black out any offending passages. But another technique, which I found very crude, just to take scissors. And this guy, you can look through his letter, there were lines that had been cut out. Okay? Now, remember our poster boy? He's not looking too chipper here. There's Charlie Lloyd Jones again. What about the enlisted men? Well, Thurl Mesker from Knoxville and Dan Bede from Burlington both experienced hell. Thurl for 2 years, Dan Bede for 6 months in Nazi Germany. And they didn't get showers for weeks on end. When they finally did, they weren't sure would it be water or... They slept Thurl said in cages, in wire enclosures, 2 men to a blanket. Do I really have to explain that one? If they were lucky, once a week they could wash their clothes in a dirty bucket. And they were given 2 few briquettes per man per week to keep the barracks heated, so invariably the windows would freeze over. Their shoes would die and they'd have to come up with surrogates. Even pencils and paper became the bread. You know, we could do a documentary, not of the differences of experience between the Germans here and the Iowans over there, but the similarities. The YMCA, the Red Cross, and they both hated each other's bread. The Americans hated German bread, and they had reason to because it was being stretched with finely ground sawdust. But civilian bread was being stretched too, so it wasn't just a favor to the Iowans. And all the POWs, they dreamt of food, they wrote about food, they sketched. Dan Bede was given other POWs' ration of chocolate bars and cigarettes, which he'd traded for other things, to draw pictures of food. And that's how desperate they were, to draw pictures of food. And Dan Bede, of course, was waiting to go home to his dad's soda fountain in South Burlington. But in reality, it was actually the Red Cross packages that kept them alive. And here's a list. In fact, I want to get something to show you from the car. Read the list while I go get it. I have here, if you want to talk about how clever our Iowa boys were, what do you think this is?
Cigarette carton.
Yeah, what's it made out of? No! That wasn't very good. Yeah, that was very bad actually.
Lead or aluminum?
This is a Spam can. This was given to us by a widow in southeast Iowa whose husband, now deceased, made this Spam can into a cigarette holder. I'm going to make a little advertisement here, not because I put a bag bottle on the back of the table for loose change, but rather for something else. We are trying desperately to collect all the things from the Iowa POW story that we can. The men didn't have a lot. A lot of them were on this death march at the end of the war. They didn't have enough. They didn't have a lot anyway. But if you know of any letters from POWs or little trinkets that they have, we want to create a permanent memorial to these guys. But time is passing. I was in Knoxville at the Vets Hospital last fall, and a guy in Eddyville said, "Come and visit me." Well, I got there day before yesterday on this tour, and I found out from his wife he died a month and 3 days ago. The time is running out. We don't have the funds we need for a camera and for film. We need gas money and that stuff. We're going as fast as we can. Today I bolted down to Keokuk before this. I got here 15 minutes before 7, having been to Keokuk, and a widow gave me these letters that her husband wrote, love letters from the camp, and lots of other things, photos of them when they met in New York, and his ID card, which just fell out of the book. I'm really stupid. Anyway, with his picture and his thumb fingerprints. This is the kind of stuff that we want to preserve for the future, the 3D items, but also she gave us, I can't believe she gave this to us. Not that we're jerks or anything, but he wrote, dedicated to my daughter Joanne, and he wrote by hand about his 2 years in Nazi German POW camps. Now it is a leap of faith to give this to strangers like me. However, I think we've proven that we're serious about what we're doing. If these things don't go to a responsible place, they end up in a drawer somewhere. The worst part is the son or the grandchild who puts it on eBay. That's happened too. That sucks. People put this stuff on eBay. They sell Granddaddy's journal. All right, so you get the idea. Let's go on. These Red Cross packages would have chocolate bars. The men would trade them among themselves for other items, or they'd take the cigarettes, the ones the Germans hadn't already evacuated from the Red Cross box, and they'd trade it with the Germans for razor blades or a shoe repair kit or whatever. And one year the Red Cross even brought the tree and all the dressings for the Christmas tree, a la Camp Algona. Anyway, little Dan Bede, who came a little bit plump anyway, he had some weight to lose, thank God, he wasn't working with a syrup ladle and an ice cream scoop anymore. He'd been sent to the power plant and he was shoveling coal. And one day he's putting coal into the machinery and he sees this poster. Psst, find Hurt mit, which means quiet. The enemy's listening. And he was frightened until he remembered, wait a minute, we're the enemy. And the guys got really excited when the first observation planes began to circle overhead and they knew the war was going to end. Well, that's what's going on for Dan Bede, but what about our true hero who was there 2 years, Thurl Mesker of Knoxville? He wasn't shoveling coal in central Germany, he was shoveling potatoes on a Junker estate near Danzig, under the watchful eyes of an estate manager, in the mud and in the rain, with no thoughts of escape because of the guard dogs. And now, this is where I want to conclude our program with a story. Not that I haven't told you a lot of stories anyway tonight, but this is a stork's nest in the village of Jasko, which no longer exists as such. It used to be in German Baltic region in Danzig. Now it's occupied by Poles and what they call Gdansk. But in German culture, storks don't just bring babies, they bring good luck. And Thurl Mesker, our hero from Knoxville, had relative good luck. You can read about it in his diary. And I told you that there was this poster family, the Voss family, and they're the reason why we really shouldn't fight war. And I'll tell you the story. Thurl was lucky because he was taken out of the POW camp, the barn where he'd been writing his journal, and he was given to the local village blacksmith to work as the blacksmith's apprentice. But the blacksmith wasn't a blacksmith at all. The blacksmith had been the village pastor until the Nazis took power, and he refused to give a Hitler greeting from the pulpit. He said, this is God's house, not Adolf Hitler's house. And he was sent to a concentration camp, a KZ, for 6 months. And when he came back, he wasn't allowed to preach because he'd been tainted by these dissident thoughts. For God's sakes, you're not allowed to have free ideas under dictatorship. And so he and his wife started this blacksmith shop. Well, he, Herr Voss, and his sweet wife, Frau Voss, the postmistress of the village, they had a problem because their 3 sons had already all been sent to the front and they all killed as they were forced to fight the Russians. They had 2 daughters though. Here's Dora, who was, I don't know, 16 or so. And they would give money to Dora on Sundays to go to the camp and give bribe money to the guards and take Thurl home. And Thurl would go, and he basically spent most of the rest of the Sundays of the war in civilian clothes, because they didn't want to raise the suspicion of the neighbors, in the Voss's garden, or in the Wohnstübchen, the little parlor, snuggling with Dora, or at the dinner table eating Frau Voss's wonderful cake made with fake coffee beans. But it all turned into a nightmare. Of course, because we saw that he was quite a good looker in the earlier pictures, Dora fell in love with him and wanted to move to Iowa after the war. And she and her family would smuggle him eggs and butter to keep him alive. Fate had a different plan. Let me read to you 2 letters in conclusion from the Voss family, and I think you'll see why people really should think twice. December 46. Dear Thurl, I have so often wished that I could hear from you. Mail service is not too good and you are silent. Did you get the letter that I mailed you February 6th? I sent it through the Polish post office. The Polish post, it's no longer Germany. A third of it was lost to the Poles. Thurl, is there any way on earth that you could help me? You well know that I would not ask you for any aid or assistance if I could go through this horrible thing alone. But lately it has been even worse, as many are at the end of their strength. Lately it has been even worse, as many are hungry. I'm sorry. As many at the end of their strength. My parents are old, full of worry and hungry. They do not have any desire to live. Already there are 38 dead in Yasko, and there were only 90 in the beginning. My parents are so changed that you would never recognize them. They are fast becoming victims of these terrible times, and I cannot do anything to help them. As a prisoner of war, Thor, you had it very bad in spite of the little we were able to do for you, but you could do it alone. You knew that your parents and loved ones were all right in faraway America. I am watching my parents starve to death. You know how we all felt about Hitler and the war. We couldn't help it, could you? Billa is dead. Now who's Billa? It's the older sister who one day was smuggling a fish to Thurl under her coat, and as she went to give it to him, the German guards saw her and shot her dead on the spot. So from 5 children, the pastor and his good postmistress wife of the village had one left at the end of the war. They lost their village, their country, their 4 out of 5 children. They had nothing to do with this war. Billa is dead. It was by a chance she took of her own free will. We are not asking you to help to the extent of endangering your life or violating the laws of your country or conscience. What is she doing in this letter? She's begging. But it hurts too much. It hurts your pride, your self-respect to come out and beg. So she alludes to her sister's slaughter at his aid, and then she moves on. Many are having typhus here. Malnutrition is a dreaded enemy. Did Bowman deliver the food we sent to Lauenburg? My father's apprentice, Herbert, is still alive. He risked his life many times in caring for you as he promised, and caring for us as he promised you he would do. I send greetings from him and from Mom and Dad. And now farewell, Dora. Her father picks up the pen and writes, also in December 46, Mr. Mesker, our good friend, I, my wife, and youngest daughter Dorschen are still here in Yasko, the place where you were a prisoner of war. A year after you left, when the Poles took over, most of the Germans were forced to leave and were moved westward over the Oder, which is today Germany's eastern border. The greater portion left willingly under pressure of hunger. As a blacksmith, I do not have a permit to leave and will probably remain here the rest of my life and let them make a Pole out of me. We have no newspapers, no radios. We're cut off from the whole world. Conditions are enough to drive us mad. Our Dorschen is very downhearted and blue and says if only you could come from America, you could do something to help us here. And knowing you as I do, I believe it too. It is not easy for a young girl to live here, to see all this and no future. Our beloved Billa's life was sacrificed. He too touches it and then walks away. Times have changed. Now we are the Gefangenen, the prisoners. We have no rights. The Russians and Poles do with us as they please. Our greatest need, a package came, and the sender's name was Mesker. It was a wonderful help and a treat, something we are not able to get here now. We send our hearty thanks. All the comfort and aid we received here come from our earnest prayers to God. Such true friendship and trust as we have in you means much to us. The Russians made short process of everything, and so far as we can see, there's no Germany in the future. As far as our future is concerned, you folks in America know more about it than we do. We're cut off entirely from the whole world, and I would be very grateful if you would give me the American slant on things. What about the Russian and Polish rule? Please let me know what you think. Wishing you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. May God grant you good health and hearty greetings from our grateful family, Rudolf Voss.
Did they get any help from him?
He, according to the letter, he had apparently already sent some packages. I don't know if he sent any more after that letter, but the father acknowledged the one that did arrive. It's an interesting concept that a former slave laborer sends aid to the former slaver. Of course, it wasn't quite that easy. The Vosses, I don't think, played that role very willingly. Any other questions or comments? Or
How can we not have war when there are Hitlers and Stalins and Husseins?
It's a good question. I've been giving these lectures for a couple of years. Lately, that question comes up every time. Our role at Traces is to document and present the history of the 30s and 40s because we believe that the past is a window to the present. As someone who partly gets public monies, I'm not at liberty to be partisan about current issues. But what I can say is that Woodrow Wilson wanted us to join the League of Nations. In fact, he wanted to create the League of Nations after World War I, and it was the American voters who said, we don't want to be part of any entangling alliances, and so he couldn't join it. The Senate wouldn't hear of it. And we didn't join the League of Nations, and there was no counterweight for Hitler. There was none. Instead of a United Nations, instead of a group of countries together to put their force into one voice, the French couldn't really stand up to Germany. The English had that pathetic Chamberlain who was a fool. Italy, of course, was fascist anyway. The Russians were doing their thing. There was no united effort, and we certainly botched that one. I'd like to think that had we joined the League of Nations, they might have had some effect against this madness in Europe. And remember that Hitler grew out of the ashes of World War I. This all has a context. He didn't just arrive on the scene out of an eggshell. This man came out of the frustration and the suffering of World War I, which had its roots in the Bismarck War 40, 50 years earlier, which had its roots, and war, I'm afraid, is an endemic thing that keeps reappearing, and every generation pledges, this is the last. Everyone, I found a book in the library the other day, it was free in the box, take it, nobody wants to read it, and said, the last war. Everyone says, this is it, after this, we're going to come to our senses, this is the last. Other questions, comments?
These books to which you referred, are those in our library?
Some of them are. I'm afraid that the book, the journals of the Iowa POWs, I sold out in Washington. The book is very popular. If you'd like to order it, would you be willing to take people's names and? Okay, and we'll even meet you halfway in the postage because it's our fault we didn't pack enough. We had no idea that the book would be so happily bought. The other books are all in the back, and I'll go on the way out. We sell all our books, and I might say that we fund our project largely through our book sales. We have a little, metaphorically, we have a little beggar cup, and it's hard to get public monies for this kind of stuff. History really isn't very valued. Look at all, no offense, but look at all your hair colors. The people who need to hear these stories aren't here tonight. They're your grandkids who are working with their Nintendo boxes back home. You guys know this stuff. Every one of you, with a few exceptions, and you know who you are. I'm the youngest person in the room, I think. All right? There's something wrong here. All right? Other questions, comments?
He's younger than you.
That's one exception, all right. I'm 40.
Ah, you got it.
All right. So, other questions, comments, protests? Because some people hate our program. Some love it. Any others? Okay. Thank you. And do stop and have a look at our table in the back.